Hi, I'm James Marino from Cleveland State University in the United States. I'm going to talk about my book, Owning William Shakespeare, for Festival Shakespeare Buenos Aires. Hello, I'm James J. Marino from Cleveland State University in Cleveland, Ohio, United States. I am so grateful to be speaking to Festival Shakespeare Buenos Aires. I only wish I could be with you in person. I hear that autumn in Buenos Aires is just fabulous. Spring in Cleveland, Ohio is not bad. Um, I'm delighted to be invited to here to speak. I want to talk today about some ideas for my book, Owning William Shakespeare. So one question is, who owned Shakespeare? And the simplest answer to that is mostly not Shakespeare. Before 1709, English law had no copyright law. So until almost a century after Shakespeare's dead, there are some ways that various artists could get some practical control over their works, especially plays, but none of this was situated in the writers. The writer's claim was moral, it was never legal. The government had no interest in protecting a poet's right to a poem. They had other things to worry about. This was good for Shakespeare in some ways. He could use other writers' work completely freely, and he does. He is constantly borrowing, sometimes by our standards, plagiarizing, adapting the work of other writers. He doesn't have to pay them, he doesn't need their permission. It's bad for Shakespeare in some ways in that a piece of writing just cannot become inheritable property. So his wife and daughters had no rights in anything he'd written. As a writer, he didn't have rights in anything he'd written, so there was nothing to hand down. Also, what Shakespeare could do to other writers, writers could do to him. During his own lifetime, another playwright, Thomas Haywood, the working man's playwright, the blue collar version of Shakespeare, just takes one of Shakespeare's non dramatic poems, The Rape of Lucrece, and turns it into a play. What can Shakespeare do about that? Nothing. Nothing. Same thing, no one can do anything to him about taking, say, Robert Greene's Pandosto and turning it into something we think rather better. So, who controlled plays? Practical control belonged to three groups: the printers, the London Company of Stationers, who controlled the bookselling and printing industry, who were interested in controlling the rights to printed books; the acting companies, the playing companies, of whom Shakespeare was a partner of a very powerful company that started out being called the Lord Chamberlain's Men, later the King's Men. I know Lucy Monroe is going to speak to the festival about them. They're fascinating. And of course, the crown, which always has the kind of right to interfere, to grant monopolies. These work in different ways. To the degree that anything that looks like intellectual to property to us operated in the 16th and 17th century in London, it came ultimately from censorship. Elizabeth I never lost a moment's sleep in her entire long reign over which artist owned which art. This didn't bother her in the least. Elizabeth I was very interested in not being overthrown and killed. She was excited about this. Not being overthrown and killed was a major point of emphasis for her. She was really committed to this idea. So her government took real steps to control the dissemination of information. For the printers, this meant that all the printing, with a few exceptions, all of the printing in England was limited to the London Guild, the London Company of Stationers. had to put their own names on what they printed so that if there was any problem, if the governments had any concern, they knew exactly where to go and which printer to control. Rather than having printing dispersed all over the kingdom, it's all going to be in London where the government can keep a close eye on that. The printers shared all the printing in the country together. They could operate together as a kind of guild or cartel to avoid competition with each other, to make sure they weren't treading on each other's business. This is their version of property. Acting companies are also censored and regulated. They have to have a patron who is who becomes the patrons become increasingly higher and higher ranking, more and more connected to the government, and everything they perform has to be passed by censors. The master of revels needs to approve each play before it can be publicly given. And here's the trick for the actors. The master of revels approves a play to be performed by a specific company. At the point of approving for performance, the censor and regulator gives exclusive control of that play to that group. We do know of a company in the provinces who get arrested late in Shakespeare's career, and they're doing some of his plays and some other plays, and they say, well, these were licensed to be printed, they must be okay. It's like, no, but they weren't licensed to be performed by you. They were licensed to be performed by the Kingsmen. The Kingsmen want to do King Lear. They may. You didn't get permission. The third group who has control is, well, the crown itself, which reserves the right to grant monopolies to whoever it really likes. Partly it's its taxing power, and simply the Queen can simply say, and later King James can simply say, okay, this group can print this book for this many years. This playing company can have this. This poet can have that. Why? Because of monarchy. That's that simple. So the printers, the players, and the crown officials have three very different models of what it means to own a player, to control it, and different ideas about where a property line begins and ends. The printers want to avoid competition with each other. A book is expensive to print. It takes years to sell through your inventory. You don't want another printer coming and competing with your property. So the printers are very concerned that no one compete with each other. They create, they have a register. Our word copyright comes from their term registering one's copy in the so-called stationer's register, the log of this guild, to say, this is mine, no one else can print it. And the guild would enforce that. They tend to see similar works as a single property, things that we might consider a group of different plays on the same topic. The printers might see as like, no, I have the right to print a play about Henry V. Why is there this other play about Henry V? It's eating into my market. This is unfair to me. I need to protect my investment. Have my guild brother stop that. This isn't just about drama. There's an early, well, we would call him a veterinarian, Jervis Markham, who goes and sells nearly every printer in London slightly different books about, how to take care of horses. And the printers are incensed. They are furious. It's like, it doesn't matter that they're distinct books about horses. We all have a book of your advice on horse ailments. We can't make a living. You have to stop this, you wicked, wicked veterinarian. And so when the printers see two different plays about the reign and victories of King Henry V, they see a problem. What a headache. Someone is being cheated. Now, the players compete against the rival companies. They are not in a guild with the other actors. They're in a group of companies that compete against one another. So they are constantly trying to update their own offerings to keep them alive, to keep them lively. This is the first generation where English plays remain marketable over a period of decades. If you ever read a play from the 1570s, kind of the decade before Shakespeare starts working, those plays become no longer commercial fairly quickly. You can't do them 10 years later. Around the time that Shakespeare and Marlowe and Kidd begin, you start to see plays that can hold the stage and for a paying audience for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. This changes the whole business. But to keep them viable commercially as tastes change, there will be tweaks. The acting company will revise this, they'll have an addition, they'll change. Tastes have changed. We're going to change the play with them. We're going to keep things up to date. We don't want to be doing old fashioned stuff. Shakespeare is very, very good, especially in his 30s, with kind of keeping things up to date. He's considered in the 5090s, really, he's the leading edge of where dramatic art is happening. He's very hip. The the players also imitate each other's offerings. They can't outright take each other's plays, but we can do a play like that play. You've got a revenge drama. Oh, we've got a revenge drama, but our drama is a little more sophisticated, a little hipper. We can beat you, and they will keep doing this. So they tend to do this kind of. This is exactly what the printers don't want them to do. They see 2 or 3 plays about King Henry V that are different. They will see them as distinct, and they will see that as progress. See, they keep getting better. Now, from the printer's standpoint, if you invested many, many pounds in printing a book that was the play of King Henry V, and you've sold only about half your inventory, and it's 5 years later, and someone has another play about Henry V, that's a problem for you. And the argument that the new play about Henry V is better than the one you printed that you still haven't sold out of doesn't make it better for you. That makes it worse. Now, where are the royal officials are on this, in all this? Wherever they want to be, because they're court officials and they tend to be arbitrary, autocratic. Monarchy tends to not always be interested in the rule of law. So the uh, the court officials tend to intervene from time to time to overrule the players or to overrule the printers, to abrogate the rules that these groups of artistic professionals had for themselves. That's only the players or the printers' own understanding of things. It doesn't have any legal force, and government officials can come in and demand something else be done their way because they're government officials. Um, Two things about this. One is that in terms of lobbying the government and getting kind of favor with the court officials, as a group, the actors are much, much better than the printers. They are much better at gaining the government's ear. Also, they perform for these people several times a year. They're fashionable people. The printers don't have anything like that kind of social status or cachet. They're not cool. The actors are cool, and they use it to get the government to do what they want sometimes. It's also important to recognize there's one particular influential noble family. We call them the Sidney Pembroke faction or the Sidney Pembroke Leicester faction, whatever we want to call them. They're they're the extended family of the poet Sir Philip Sidney. They tend to be extremely interested in poets' literary rights in a way that sometimes seems to prefigure the way we think about these kind of copyright issues. What they're interested in is their clients' own rights, that the poets under their protection get what the Sidney family thinks is coming to those poets. This really begins, I think, with protecting the rights of, well, Uncle Philip. After Sidney passed away, suddenly all his work flooded into print, and his family became very involved in trying to manage the publication. Where does this leave Shakespeare? In 1594, when Shakespeare's 30 years old, the acting company that he will be associated with for the rest of his life, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, later known as the King's Men, forms. They're a new company with a repertory of older plays. We know they have a bunch of plays that have been around for 10 or 15 years that are maybe getting a little shop worn. They have some version of Taming of the Shrew. They have a version of Hamlet that's clearly not the version we know. They have Titus Andronicus, which now doesn't seem so fashionable to us. they have some version of King Lear, and they have a bunch of English history plays. Between 1594 and 1623, all of these plays emerge in new and different versions, and they all get Shakespeare's name attached to them. In 1594, no one is talking about any of these plays as plays by Shakespeare. By the time he dies, and 7 years after with the First Folio, they all are called Shakespeare's. If it's a play that the company started with in 1594 and that they keep over the decades, they eventually call it Shakespeare's. What seems to be happening here is I believe he is revising and rewriting this older stock to make it current, to make it up to date, or even cutting edge to win the competition with the other playing companies. And this is updating it. It's and Shakespeare's career for the first from 1594 to about 1604 1605 looks different when you see his half of his job is updating the old repertory, and then he is generating a lot of new things. The new plays he's generating that don't have anything to do with older plays tend heavily to be comedies about love, because Shakespeare before 1594 was known in print as a love poet. He's the author of Venus and Adonis. He's the author of The Rape of Lucrece. He's Monsieur Love in his own words. So you want to go either to see something he's updated, or his new things are things like Romeo and Juliet, Love's Labor's Lost, etc., etc. This all goes fairly well until sometime after Shakespeare dies. After Shakespeare dies, of course, the Shakespeare family, his descendants, are totally out of this conversation. In 1619, 3 years after Shakespeare's death, there seems to be a conflict where the printers and players' different ideas of property really come into conflict. So the players get their friends in the government, some of whom are members of the Sidney family, to forbid any printers from ever reprinting any of the players' plays. This isn't just about Shakespeare, it's also about the works of Fletcher and Beaumont, who at this moment are extremely popular, but it certainly includes Shakespeare. And this, to the printers, is totally a violation of everything they've been counting on. They invested in these books for years. They printed them, they've kept them in inventory, and they're told they can't reprint their own stock. This is a violation of the printer's ideas of copyright. They, uh, so they do what I think a reasonable person would do. They reprint the plays that they consider themselves to own, and they put fake dates on them. They print old dates on the new reprint, so it looks like it's just inventory we had in the back. Yes, I printed this. Don't No, my Lord Chamberlain, I would never violate your rule. You told me not to reprint this, and I haven't. As you can see on the title page, this was printed in 1608. I've had it for years. Um, this leads to, and here I have a PowerPoint. Here are a few of these kind of puzzling pairs of title pages, both of which seem to the naked eye to be the first edition of some of these plays. And here's which is the first edition of King Lear. They both say 1608. They have nearly identical language on the front. Which is which? Which is the first edition of The Merchant of Venice? These title pages look alike. There's very little to tell them apart. Early in the 20th century, some enterprising bibliographers finally worked out which was which. The giveaway is the printer's mark, the printer's logo, that kind of metal thing just above the printer or publisher's name, which is not movable type, which is a unique piece of metal that resided in exactly one printer's shop. So that's really the signature. That's the thumbprint. Now, the people who first discovered these kind of fake dates believed that the printers were low down and dirty rotten because these scholars always wanted to take Shakespeare's side. So anyone in conflict with Shakespeare has to be a pirate, a criminal, in league with other pirates, etc. It's more reasonable to presume these are just early modern business and protecting what they viewed as their traditional rights. Um, the real giveaway here, you see the mark of William Jaggard. It is something he had gotten in his shop. He puts on most of these falsely dated title pages. So you can see, okay, these were all printed in 1619, not in 1608 or 1600. You can also see he used it on a catalog of books for sale, a kind of trade publication, the year before he did this. So um, if he's trying to fool anybody, he's not trying to fool other printers. He's put his kind of printer's mark on a guild publication that most of them have. So this is for the one group he's not worried about exposing him with the other printers. He's not violating other printers' rights. He's probably standing up for them. So what happens between 1619 and the great collection of Shakespeare's plays, the First Folio of 1623? Somehow or another, everyone comes to the table and they agree. They get along, they make a deal. Um, if you think William Jaggard is a dirty, rotten pirate who's stealing these plays in 1619 and violating rights, you have the problem that he is also the printer of the Shakespeare First Folio. It's actually printed by his son. Mr. Jaggard Sr. had lost his eyesight by this time and couldn't print himself, but it's still the same family business. So the old story where Jaggard's a terrible pirate, he was both a terrible pirate who you shouldn't trust and the printer of the most reliable Shakespeare text. These two things can't both be true. So the Jaggard family gets the rights to print this play. They're in a syndicate with a bunch of other printers, many of whom also owned one or two or three Shakespeare plays, and with another printer named Edward Blount, who's kind of the preferred printer of a lot of um, literary and aristocratic patrons. It is sponsored, the first one is sponsored by Shakespeare's acting company, by members of the King's Men, senior members, John Hemmings and and Henry Condell. Hemmings has been in the group since Shakespeare joined, since it turned. Hemmings is the financial genius of this acting group, a fascinating figure. But they write an introduction here. So the printers and the players are getting along, and the book itself is dedicated to two brothers. They're both earls from the Sidney family, the Lord Chamberlain and his brother, who are literally Sir Philip Sidney's nephews. They're Philip Sidney's sister's sons. They're part of that bracket. So the patrons are happy, the Sidney family's happy, the printers have what they want, the players have what they want. And we, the readers, have a monument to Shakespeare and a collection of plays, including a bunch which had never been printed before. It's pretty good they made a deal. Otherwise, we wouldn't have Julius Caesar or Macbeth. Anyway.
Well, thank you, Jim. It's very interesting. And regarding the printers, did they buy those books forever?
Yeah. They, by their standards, print rights are forever. Print rights are forever. So if you're a non-dramatic poet, this is the story I'm telling is about dramatic rights where there's an important additional stakeholder. If you're just a poet, if you're not Shakespeare, but you're, say, John Milton, if you're John Milton, you sell Paradise Lost to the printer, they pay you, that's it. They own the print rights to Paradise Lost by their lights forever. In fact, by the beginning of the 18th century, the same family of pretty important printers owned both Shakespeare and Milton. When copyright becomes law in 1709, basically what happens is you cut the writer in for the first time legally, and you make the printer You limit the length of the printer's ownership. The idea that the printer would own rights to a book forever is the printer's idea. Um, in 1709, Parliament intervenes to say, okay, printers can't have rights forever. Authors can have rights for this many years. Originally, it was 14 years. Copyright begins in English law as a way for hundreds of years or more, right? So yes. But in terms of like, if you were Christopher Marlowe and you went and sold actually he didn't live long enough to do this. If you sold a poem, if you sold a dramatic poem to a printer, he had it forever. You couldn't sell it again.
Yes, well, we usually say that Shakespeare wrote for the stage, for the actors, instead of for being read, basically. Did Shakespeare wrote mainly for the stage?
You know, um, let me answer those questions in turn. Does Shakespeare write primarily for the stage? My answer to that complicated question is the stage is where the real money is. When you when you write for print, you alienate the work. You get one cash payment and you're done, and it's the printer's forever. A play can potentially make you and your partner's money for decades. Yes, you can just so his financial incentives are to write for the stage. His long-term business strategy is, I'm going to write a play. I'm not sure he's planning this initially, but what eventually becomes the company's strategy is like a really great play can remain in the repertory for decades. We don't get very specific titles in court performance records till fairly late, but when we do, it's often a very old place. It's like King James I likes to see Twelfth Night. He'll see it every. A play is older than his reign in England. He just keeps watching it. So there's a reason to do that. Does Shakespeare not write for a literary or print audience at all? I wouldn't go that far. I think some of the copies there are presentation copies you might have a scribe make out for a particular patron. There are readers you want to cultivate, and there might be some thought in when the text and the folio were prepared for the printer. There was a scribe who was associated with the acting company, did make careful new copies of many of those plays. We know a lot about that scribe's particular habits. He is really preparing this for a reading audience. But the business strategy is much more about the theater than about the print market. The print market is a quick hit of capital. How much did the printers pay for a play versus some poems? Or we often don't know. They don't record their payments to writers very often. So there are novels like, what do they pay for a pamphlet? What do they pay for a collection of sonnets? What do they pay for an epic poem or a romance? I I think other scholars would be better at answering that question than I am. I don't see the payment receipts. The document we have is about the printers communicating with other printers that say, I bought this and I will pay this registration fee. Everybody else stay off my lawn. This one's mine. We don't have the receipts where they paid. So we actually don't know who sold Shakespeare's plays to the printers. I would start with thinking the company has at certain moments a reason to sell a play they've had around for a while. Um, Other scholars have told different stories where rogue actors go off and sell something. It's very hard to know. So, yeah. And what they actually pay, it's not clear. That part of the business is a little opaque to us still.
Hmm. And how many copies of a book did you have to sell in order to become a bestseller author?
Well, the bestseller is obvious. The bestseller is the Bible. Yes. Nothing's better than the Bible. And this actually, the whole guild, they share out the right, like someone has a monopoly on the Bible, but actually just charging other printers for the right to print the Bible because he can't print all the Bibles himself. We don't have wholesale or retail numbers. We can't, it's not like today where a writer can just click on Amazon and see how many copies he or she has sold and feel it's never enough. The way we judge how well a book sold is how many times it got reprinted. That is the real sign. So some works by Shakespeare that we adore only go through one printing ever. The sonnets, as we know them, one printing, done. And that is startling to us. Some of the plays are only printed once. Some of the plays get registered in the stationer's register. I bought this play, no one else do it, and then don't get printed. Um, and there are different explanations for why that might be, but it might be simply a business decision. Nah, it's not the right time. I bought As You Like It, but it's not the right time to print As You Like It. So I own it, but I'm just not gonna print it. Right. So As You Like It doesn't get a standalone printing. It has to wait for the folio in 1623. Um, what the guild really actually wants is for you not to print too many copies because they are many different things, but they are interested in protecting all the workers. What they what they don't allow their members to do is to print too many copies at one time. The maximum print run is something like 1,200 or 1,500 copies because they want you to have to pay printers and typesetters for the next edition because they're protecting workers. They're not a labor union, but they're one of the ancestors of labor unions. The answer is, if the question is, what is Shakespeare's bestseller in terms of print? It's not the plays, it's Venus and Adonis. Number two is The Rape of Lucrece, another non-dramatic poem. And we view the sonnets as much more important than we view The Rape of Lucrece or Venus and Adonis. But what sold were those two poems. In terms of the plays, the bestseller far and away for Shakespeare is Henry IV, Part 1. It goes through the most editions. They just keep printing that because people love Falstaff and people love Hotspur. They're great. Hamlet does very well. We should also remember Shakespeare's play, none of Shakespeare's individual plays are the very bestseller. The Spanish tragedy sells more even than Henry IV, Part 1. The best-selling play of this time is an anonymous play called Musidorus. What sells better than Musidorus? Nothing. Well, Venus and Adonis and the Bible.
And how long did it take to print a book like the First Folio?
The folio is printed over a period of two other books that they viewed as more important. William Jaggard is busy doing a book of heraldry that's very, very important to him. So sometimes the folio project has to stop, and they go do the heraldry book, and then they go back to the folio. So it takes a long time. I don't know exactly how. It takes a period of weeks. We know more about the printing of the folio than we know about almost any book partly because we've taken so much time and paid so much attention to it, partly because it survives in so many copies. There are well over 200 copies. It's an incredibly valuable book, but it's not a super rare one because it survived well. And partly because one collector, Henry Clay Folger, the benefactor of the Folger Shakespeare Library, collected so many individual specimens just of the first Folger that allows scholars to compare them next to each other, where normally we would be traipsing all over the globe trying to look at this one and that one. When you've got about a third of them in one place in Washington, D.C., that has sped matters up enormously. So we can see things like over different copies, they print different title pages to Romeo and Juliet, and they cancel one, they put it in and they fix it. So different copies will have different things. They don't get the rights initially to Troilus and Cressida. So when you look at the table of contents, one play is actually not listed because when they printed the table of contents, they didn't have the rights. They had to still deal with one more printer. And then it's like, all right, we got to do it. And then but then where do you put it? And it's sometimes in different places. Right. So it's complicated. Early English printing is more of an art than a science. One of the strange things is each copy of this book is probably unique. Or if there are two exactly identical copies, that's very rare. Almost any two copies of the Shakespeare you find will have some very minor differences, but we really care about Shakespeare, so we will notice these differences. And also, I will say, since I'm speaking to a Western hemispheric audience rather than a British audience, since the English aren't in the room, the English printers in 1623 are still well behind where, say, the Venetians were, right? If I'm in a rare books room and I'm reading a book, an Elizabethan printed book, I know I'm in for a certain level of difficulty. These are professionals, but they're not at the height. If I have a reason to call up a rare book printed by Aldous in Venice, well, that's going to be just beautiful. Yes, that's fabulous. And really, probably the best printers in Shakespeare's London were French refugees, were Huguenots who had fled, Huguenot printers who'd come over from Paris to escape religious oppression.
Mhm. And what about the copyright for foreign writers?
I have not made a study of copyright in or intellectual property in the other Western European countries, but it isn't much more advanced than it is in England. It might be less advanced. And there it tends to mostly be various kinds of crown monopolies. So I think the example I know best is probably the French, and it's really about the crown granting specific printers monopolies. So no. So what can Cervantes do about Shakespeare taking a story from him? Nothing, you know. All he can do probably is just like he should just have taken King Lear, right, and have Quixote meet someone, an old man with three daughters who he treats poorly, right? Give him a little get back. So yeah, so it's there's an international book trade. um, but Shakespeare has no more intellectual property obligation to other Europe to continental authors than he does to English authors. And remember too, these writers are all trained in an educational system that is about imitating, adapting, borrowing from the classics. So if what you're trained to do as a schoolboy is to take Virgil and Ovid and Cicero and rewrite them into English, the idea of rewriting other writers is what you do. It's how you begin. Imitatio, right? Imitating and adapting other authors is the core of the grammar school. But I will say this: if you want to see Shakespeare at work, the closest you will ever get to looking over his shoulder is comparing the source he's using to what he does with it. You can see him add, subtract. You can see him move words around to make them better verse. That's as close as you will get to ever seeing his practice and being in at his desk with him.
And how was your experience writing Owning Shakespeare?
Writing my book was my ticket to my own kind of guild membership in the academy. I treasure that experience. I have blotted most of it out. Yes. I'll tell you a secret. Every professor keeps his old books or her old books in her study because we need the index and the notes, right? I could not possibly remember. I have this copy here because I don't remember where I found these things out, and I need my notes now. As soon as the book was published, I guess there are so many things I was suddenly liberated to forget. Yes.
Thank you very much, Jim. It's been fantastic to talk to you, and I hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much, Patricio. And thank you, Buenos Aires.
Bye-bye.
Bye.